Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
The Defense Department is pausing the rollout of contractor cybersecurity requirements. DoD's top IT official says the current iteration of the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Program is too onerous on small businesses. She's now leading a review of the CMMC program to consider the next steps. Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday joins me now with the latest on this update. Justin, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
This sounds like a big surprise. Was it news to the industry that CMMC program was going to be just sort of instantaneously stopped?
Yeah, I think this is fair to say it was a bombshell for people who watch the CMMC program, even those who watch it closely. Because while we knew new DoD CIO Kirsten Davies had been kind of reviewing the CMMC program, she's been in the seat for only about 6 months. And so she had told lawmakers that she would do this review. They weren't quite expecting what we saw this week, which is a suspension of the CMMC requirements that were set to take effect this November. Those requirements would have essentially mandated third-party cybersecurity assessments across all contracts involving sensitive but unclassified information. These assessments have been going on kind of a voluntary basis. If a DoD program thinks that they need a third-party CMMC assessment, they can include that in their program. But it had just gotten off the ground really in the last year. And now it is being, quote, suspended. DoD is going to conduct a review of the CMMC program. And there's a lot of questions about where this goes next.
There was a lot of momentum in the industry to move towards compliance. What is DoD putting forward as their argument about why it suddenly needs a new review?
Essentially, Davies thinks that the current CMMC program, and especially these requirements for third-party assessments, conflicts with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's Acquisition Transformation Initiative. That initiative is focused on eliminating bureaucracy, enabling innovation, enabling non-traditional contractors. And in a memo, Davies writes that the CMMC program imposes, quote, significant and often prohibitive burdens on the defense industrial base, particularly small and non-traditional businesses. She says that while cybersecurity is essential, administrative compliance cannot come at the cost of warfighting capability and defense industrial base growth. And so Davies has clearly taken a look at CMMC, the requirements for third-party assessments specifically, and sided with folks like the Small Business Administration. SBA has been kind of arguing both publicly and behind the scenes for a while that CMMC, this requirement for an assessment of a company's cybersecurity practices, would be too costly. The estimates, depending on who you ask, vary widely, but it could be as little as $50,000 to many hundreds of thousands of dollars just to get an assessment of your cybersecurity practices and whether they meet DoD requirements. And so SBA was actually quoted in this press release that DoD put out. SBA Administrator Kelly Loeffler put out her own statements thanking DoD for taking this step. So this has clearly been driven by folks like the Small Business Administration who have been raising these concerns about compliance costs.
But Justin, there doesn't seem to be anything new here. I mean, the CMMC went through the whole rulemaking process. DoD had the chance to consider all of those comments. Secretary Hegseth's acquisition reform agenda isn't new either. So what is DoD hoping to uncover in a 60-day review?
Yeah, it really seems like they're going to be looking at a lot of the same questions that past CMMC leaders have looked at as they built this program up. So Davies has set up a 60-day review. She calls it a top-to-bottom review of the CMMC program, and it will be led by a review and reform task force that will look at how the cybersecurity approach can align with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's Acquisition Transformation Initiative. The mandate of the task force is to provide recommendations that prioritize speed, capability, lower barriers to entry for small, medium, and non-traditional businesses, and replaces, and again I'm quoting here from the memo, prohibitive third-party compliance models with scalable, realistic security measures. And so you read between the lines there, the whole point of CMMC has really been to do third-party compliance. So what will this task force come up with after just 60 days after years of rulemaking? We don't quite know, but they're clearly looking for a different answer.
It feels like maybe the balance of power is shifting between the compliance and security folks and the access side of the conversation.
I think that's right, because as you mentioned, this isn't a new argument when it comes to CMMC. For as long as the program has existed, there have been concerns about cost and compliance. This program has been in the making since 2019, really specifically, and it's meant to audit whether contractors are following existing cybersecurity standards. Those cybersecurity standards are not being suspended. They are still a part of contracts, but up to about this point, contractors have been able to essentially just self-attest to meeting them. And the whole point of CMMC has been to do these third-party audits to check whether the contractors are actually doing them.
So how should contractors behave during this 60-day suspension?
Well, good news is there is a request for information, so they can make their voice heard through responding to that RFI from the Defense Department. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of conversations that happen both internally and I'm sure externally in the next 2 months about the path forward here. The CMMC Review and Reform Task Force includes the Acquisition and Sustainment Directorate at the Pentagon, includes the CIO's office and several other offices. So there's kind of a really kind of cross-body task force here that's looking at this. But, they already went through rulemaking on this, so it'll be interesting to see the mechanics of how they try to change things, if they do significantly try to change things, because as we talked about, they're suspending a program that's already in motion. The contracting rules were finalized last year. The self-assessment requirements for CMMC specifically have already been mandated to start, and those are going to continue under Davies' direction here. But these third-party certification requirements, which everybody had kind of been ginning up for starting this November, are under suspension, and it's unclear when and if those will move forward.
And if you're one of those third-party audit firms, what happens to you?
Yeah, it's a huge question. The DoD has set up a cyber accreditation body. This is a nonprofit that DoD set up through essentially a no-cost contract to oversee this ecosystem, as they call it, of third-party auditors that this DoD and the cyber accreditation body essentially built from the ground up, because there isn't an assessment regime that exists like this today. And so these third-party auditors have been built over years. People have invested money. You can see if you go to LinkedIn, there's a lot of consternation from those folks specifically about the future here, because they've invested time and money and staff and resources in building up capacity for third-party audits. And it's unclear whether there will be much demand for that on the back end of this review. If you read between the line of Davies' memo, she doesn't seem to think much of this whole idea of third-party certification to begin with. So what happens to all those folks? Only time will tell with this review, but they are certainly feeling in a very tenuous position right now.
That's Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. Justin, I feel like you and I are going to have several more conversations about this topic.
We certainly will. Thanks, Terry.
You can find his story on federalnewsnetwork.com.